Welcome to the lecture on Role-Based Access Control or RBAC. Role-Based Access Control is the most widely used access control model in the world. Let's formally define it first. So, RBAC is a system where permissions are assigned to roles. So the key point here is roles. So we are not assigning permissions to users. Okay, we are assigning permissions to roles and users are assigned to those roles. So basically what it means is that we do not need to assign permissions individually. We can basically create roles and then we put users in these roles. Now just to clarify, as a cybersecurity specialist, you will most likely be working on RBAC based access control. So for example, according to National Institute of Standards and Technology or NIST, over 80% of organizations with over 500 employees implement RBAC or RBAC-like models to manage access to systems and data. So it is very likely that if you work on access control models in a professional organization, then most likely you'll be working on role-based access control. So this is one of the most widely used, one of the most flexible systems that you can use. Now, let me give you an example to clarify the concept. Let's say that you work in an organization in which different departments are allocated different floors. Let's assume that you work in the finance department. You are assigned a card that opens only the finance department floor. It won't open the door to the IT department, for example. Similarly, an IT person's card will only open their door and not yours. Why is that? That's because your cards are assigned to groups or roles. You are in the finance personnel group, whereas your colleague could be in the IT group. So access is determined based on the group that you belong to. That's the key idea of role-based access control. Let me give you an example. So let's say in an organization, if you have a bunch of people, and let's say there are two big groups or two different roles who need different types of permissions. So instead of assigning permissions individually to each of these users, and here there are just 4, imagine you have 4,000 employees, okay? Instead of assigning permissions individually, what you do is that you create these roles like managers or engineers, and then you assign people to those roles. And then based on their role, so for example, managers may be able to access certain documents which may be considered classified for engineers, for example. So engineers would have their own permissions. For example, engineers may be able to work on AWS infrastructure, code, those kind of things. Whereas managers may have access to reports, confidential reports, financial forecasts, those kind of things. So coming back to the basic idea is that you don't want to assign permissions individually because that will become very complex, very cumbersome, and it will be difficult to maintain. So what you do is that you define roles and then you assign people to these roles or these groups. So you don't say John can read payroll data. You say finance role can read payroll data and John is in finance. So that's the basic idea. Let's delve in a bit more. So there are 3 main things that you need to understand. First are users, then you have roles, and then you have permissions. So user is simply an individual or an entity. It could be a system or a service that needs to interact with your system. And every user will have a unique identity. For example, it could be an email, username, employee ID. This is crucial for accountability, right? We need to know who is performing actions. Next point is roles. So roles create the bridge between users and permissions. A role is a collection or logical grouping of permissions that are typically needed by a specific job function or responsibility within an organization. Think of a role like a job title within your organization. For example, it could be manager, it could be HR administrator, customer service agent. So all of these are roles. So instead of assigning dozens of permissions to each user individually, you assign a user to one or more roles. And then every role has its own specific set of permissions which are already defined. Now, how does it help? It simplifies management in so many different ways. For example, consider onboarding. When a new employee joins, you simply assign them the relevant role for their position. For example, if they are a software engineer, they may be an HR manager, they may be in customer support. So they can instantly get the necessary access because they'll be assigned the appropriate role, which already has the defined set of permissions. This makes onboarding really simple. Next, imagine there is a person, let's say this person, and they want to change the job role or they want to change their actual job within the department. Or imagine they get promoted. Okay, in that case, you don't need to specifically create new permissions for this one. You can simply assign them a different role. So let's say previously this person was a sales representative. Okay, now he becomes a sales manager. So you just need to switch the role that he's assigned to, and all the permissions would automatically switch. Finally, what are permissions? Permission is basically a specific action or ability within the system. So it could be the ability to read documents, edit user profiles, delete records, approve purchase orders, access database, all those kinds of different things. And realistically speaking, in every organization, there'll be so many different permissions. For example, starting from different types of documents, different types of databases, different type of systems, all those cloud-based systems and so many different moving parts. So it becomes really hard to manage or assign thousands of individual permissions to every single user in a large organization. So it becomes really difficult to assign permissions to so many different things and then assign users to those permissions. So two sorts of issues, too many users and too many permissions. So how do we solve it? We put all the users in groups and we bundle permissions within different permission groups, which we call as roles. This makes the end-to-end job really easy and simple. Once again, just to give you an example, let's say we're discussing the role of HR manager. Okay. So in this case, the role is HR manager. What are the permissions? They have the permission to view employee data or edit leave records. Now there is a user called Alice. So they are assigned the HR manager role. So this user is assigned the HR manager role. So she inherits the permissions that are embedded within that role. And what is a typical use case of RBAC or role-based access control? It's widely used in enterprise systems like AWS Identity and Access Management, Azure Active Directory, internal web applications, and so many different use cases. The reason being that it's really flexible and relatively easy to manage. As in life, everything has pros and cons. So let's discuss those. So what are the strengths? It is highly scalable and easy to manage because instead of managing individual user permissions, administrators assign permissions to roles. And when an employee's responsibilities change, they can access this simply by changing their role. Makes onboarding and offboarding really efficient. And as organizations grow, adding new users and roles is really straightforward. The next advantage is that usually organizations have a typical hierarchy. For example, you can have, for example, CEO, then you can have senior managers, then maybe tech leads, senior engineers, sales representatives. So sort of like a natural hierarchy. And this can easily be translated into roles. So for example, you can create a, for example, CEO role with very top level permissions. Then you can create another role as senior manager and then assign permissions to those and then for managers and so on and so forth. So basically you can take the existing hierarchy in the organization and simply convert it into a permissions hierarchy, one-to-one. It also enforces something which is very important in cybersecurity, the concept of least privilege principle. This means that a user, application or system component should only have the minimum access rights or permissions necessary to perform its tasks and nothing more. This reduces the risk of accidental damage, malicious misuse, or security breaches. So for example, let's say you're creating a manager role. So you should assign exactly the permissions that are needed by that role. Nothing more, nothing less. This makes sure that even if that role becomes compromised, they won't be able to do stuff which, for example, just the CEO role can do. Another advantage is improved compliance and auditability. So RBAC creates a clear auditable trail of who accessed what and when, which is crucial for demonstrating compliance with regulatory standards such as GDPR, HIPAA, or ISO 27001. However, there are some disadvantages as well. So for example, you can have something which we call as role explosion. In large or complex organizations, defining the right set of roles can be a significant challenge, requiring extensive business knowledge and coordination across departments. And if you create roles that are too specific or too granular, or ad hoc roles are created for every slight variation. So imagine you have already created a role for managers, right? But now you have a specific manager who needs one additional permission. So you'll have to create an additional role for that manager, and so on and so forth. Over time, you could have an explosion of roles. Another issue is lack of flexibility. So, like I just mentioned, so if you have already defined a role and you want an exception to be added to that role, it's really hard to do that. You'll probably have to create a new role or update that role, and then that exception would apply to everyone within that role. Okay? Finally, there's also a bit of admin overhead, because roles and their associated permissions require continuous review, updates, and adjustments as job responsibilities change or the organization evolves. And if it is not properly maintained, roles can become outdated